to publish explosive intelligence leaks concerning apparent Australian monitoring of the Indonesian president. They went to the ABC. Auntie's decision to run big with the story has landed it in a place it does not want to be, in trouble with a new Conservative government, the Abbott government, and the PM himself. Very poor judgment, says Tony Abbott. Why, he adds, should the ABC be acting as an advertising agent for a left-wing British newspaper? Every Wednesday, Breaking Politics is joined by Tony Abbott's Parliamentary Secretary, Josh Frydenberg. Welcome into the studio, Josh.
Nice to be here with you, Tim.
What is the sin that the ABC has committed here?
Look, we all believe in freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. That's absolutely paramount. And the editors are entitled to publish what they think is in the public interest. My concern is that these stories were not in the public interest to be out there. They were first broken by The Guardian, you were right, but they were given great amplification by the ABC. The other point here is, Tim, the ABC have a special responsibility as the national broadcaster and as the party responsible for sending the national message into the region. And these allegations were very damaging to Australia's relationships in the region.
So what should the ABC have done here? Not run the news?
Well, we don't think that they should have been the ones, breaking it on the back of The Guardian, and the Prime Minister's absolutely right. The
so
ABC,
run it quietly, if you like.
Well, no, I don't believe they should have been, giving this any currency, really. That if The Guardian wants to break that story, so be it. But it seemed that the ABC and The Guardian were working in tandem, and that the ABC, was giving amplification to The Guardian's initial story.
So let's be clear here. We're talking about the national broadcaster putting Australia's foreign policy objectives ahead of its news judgment and not telling the Australian people about a story that would have been breaking in other media.
Look, we're talking about the public interest. We're not talking about Australia's particular foreign policy objectives. We're talking about what is in the public interest. And both Malcolm Turnbull, as the Minister responsible for the ABC, and the Prime Minister have made strong statements that they thought it was poor judgment by the ABC to broadcast this.
Which in a general sense you can understand, but how would the ABC have applied this? I mean, would the news director have had to go up to those framing the news and say, no, we're staying away from that Guardian story? I mean, practically what could they have done differently to what they did?
That's a matter for Mark Scott as the managing director and his board, may I say, because obviously this is a very serious matter, and who knows whether he in fact discussed it at length with his board. That's probably a good question to ask him. But the point here is, I don't believe it was in the public interest for those allegations to be given the currency that they were by the ABC.
There's some new allegations out there this morning with regard to East Timor and apparent efforts by Australian intelligence agents a decade ago to permanently bug East Timor's cabinet. Are you sure? I doubt you want to comment on a lot of specifics. I'm making a guess there. But are you sure our intelligence agencies are always operating within their need to protect our national security and not wandering off on commercial objectives?
Well, firstly, we do not comment on specific matters in relation to these allegations about East Timor. The second point to mention is that I have great confidence in the capacity and the integrity of our intelligence agencies. There are checks and balances, Tim. There is an Inspector General of Intelligence, and there's also a Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence and Security Matters, which has representation from both sides of the political divide. So I'm very confident that whatever our intelligence agencies do is, one, in the national interest, and two, in accordance with the law.
That's important because two cases now, the SBY case and now the East Timor case, both in their own way draw into question whether Australian intelligence operatives ought to have been doing what apparently they were ordered to do. So regardless of whether you'll comment on the detail, Australian people have got a right to be asking some questions now about whether intelligence isn't ranging a bit far, haven't they?
Well, the Australian people can be very confident that the intelligence community plays a vital role in protecting the interests of Australia. I don't need to tell you or to remind you, Tim, that more than 100 Australians have lost their lives in terrorist attacks overseas, including 9/11 and of course the tragedy of the Bali bombing. Australia's intelligence community does an enormous amount of good work to protect the livelihood and the interests of Australians and Australia's interests, and I have great confidence that they have done that in the past and they'll continue to do that in the future.
Quite, which is why we need to give them some protection and some secrecy about what they do.
Absolutely.
But the total secrecy here seems to have led to situations where, for example, bugging the cabinet of one of the poorest countries on earth, East Timor, for what may not have been but could be construed as Australia's commercial benefit, seems frankly grubby, doesn't it?
Well, I'm not going to comment on individual allegations, other than to say there are checks and balances. We have an Inspector General of Intelligence and we have a Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence and Security Matters. So I'm very confident that those checks and balances ensure that whatever is done A, in the national interest, and B, in accordance with the law.
The Immigration Minister Scott Morrison, apparently, according to some coverage this morning, has ordered a freeze on refugee applications for the 30,000 or more making them to this country until the temporary protection visa issue is sorted out. Why should those people suffer in this way for a political difference here in Canberra over how to handle the matter?
Well, let's put some facts on the table, Tim, to put this whole issue in context. Under the previous government, our border protection system unravelled and it was disasters. Of course, the greatest tragedy was more than 1,000 people losing their lives at sea. There was more than 50,000 unauthorised boat arrivals, including thousands of children, and there was an $11 billion blowout in the budget for border protection measures. Now, as a consequence, 33,000 people currently are in detention and on bridging visas. That's a large number of people. If they were to be granted permanent visas, you would in fact be saying to the people smugglers who profited out of these people's misery, well, you have been successful. You have had a product that you sold for good reason, because these people have been granted permanent residency. And we did not want to go down that path, and that is why we were very consistent with our pre-election position, which was that the temporary protection visas should be reintroduced, just as they were an essential part of the border protection strategy in the Howard years. They are during the Abbott years. We were blocked in the Senate by the Greens and the Labor Party, and until we are granted that process, then the TPVs, Scott Morrison has made clear that he is not going forward with more permanent visas.
Right, so that is absolutely the situation. No permanent visas until temporary protection visas are a reality.
Well, as he has said, Scott Morrison, in his public comments, he has put a cap on the number of permanent visas.
Foreign Affairs Minister Julie Bishop travels to Indonesia tomorrow, I think, to meet Marty Natalegawa, the Foreign Affairs Minister from Indonesia. Our relations are in bad shape, aren't they?
I'm very confident, Tim, that the relationship will get back to where it was, which is because of the mutual interests that Australia and Indonesia share. We work very effectively together on counter-terrorism measures, on border protection measures. We have very strong people-to-people links with more than 14,000 Indonesian students studying in Australia, hundreds of thousands of Australians travelling to Indonesia every year. Obviously the trade and the investment side is very important too. We can't allow the relationship to deteriorate any further. Obviously this has been a difficult and challenging time in the relationship, but I'm very confident that through the good work of Julie Bishop and Tony Abbott and their other ministers, the relationship will get back to where it was.
To close, when relationships suffer this kind of damage, surely we need to hold somebody responsible for that. Who takes the blame for our current relations with Indonesia? Where's the fault?
Well, I'm not going to be pinning blame anywhere, because the key point for Australia is to get the relationship back to where it was. I was very proud of the relationship Australia had with Indonesia during the time of the Howard and Downer years. In fact, John Howard dealt with 5 Indonesian presidents, from President Suharto through to SBY. The relationship was strengthened through various treaty arrangements like the Lombok Treaty and an expansion in our aid program and the like. I'm very confident that we will get back to those good times with Indonesia in the very near future.
Josh Frydenberg, we're grateful for you coming in today.
Great to be with you, Tim.